Komarov, Soyuz 1. On April 22, 1967, Vladimir Komarov walked through the corridors of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, knowing he was likely walking to his death. The 40-year-old Soviet cosmonaut had been selected to pilot Soyuz 1, the first crewed flight of the Soviet Union's new spacecraft, designed to outpace America's Apollo program. But Komarov knew what his superiors were hiding from the public. His friend and fellow cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had desperately tried to convince mission planners to delay the flight. Over 200 technical problems had been identified in the Soyuz spacecraft during pre-flight testing, including critical failures in the parachute system, unstable attitude control, and faulty heat shield bonding. Soviet engineers had submitted report after report documenting these dangerous defects, but political pressure from the Kremlin overruled safety concerns. The mission was scheduled to coincide with Lenin's birthday and the May Day parade, giving Communist Party leaders a propaganda victory they desperately needed. Komarov understood the impossible situation. If he refused to fly, his backup pilot Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space and a Soviet hero, would take his place. Komarov couldn't let his friend die in a spacecraft he knew was defective. At 3:35 a.m. Moscow time on April 23rd, Soyuz 1 lifted off from Baikonur into the pre-dawn darkness. The problems began almost immediately. One of the spacecraft's two solar panels failed to deploy properly, cutting power generation in half and making it impossible to properly orient the craft toward the sun. Without adequate solar panel positioning, the spacecraft's batteries began draining rapidly. The ion sensors that controlled the craft's attitude became unreliable, causing Soyuz 1 to tumble uncontrollably through space. Komarov fought to stabilize his ship manually, using precious fuel reserves to fire the attitude control thrusters. Ground control monitored the mounting problems with growing alarm. The planned rendezvous with Soyuz 2, which was supposed to launch the next day with 3 cosmonauts aboard, was immediately cancelled. After 18 increasingly desperate orbits, Mission Control ordered Komarov to attempt an emergency re-entry over the Soviet Union. As Soyuz 1 began its descent on April 24th, Komarov manually oriented his spacecraft for re-entry, knowing his life depended on systems that had already proven unreliable. The descent through the upper atmosphere proceeded normally at first, with the heat shield protecting the crew compartment as designed. But as the spacecraft slowed to subsonic speeds at an altitude of 23,000 feet, the main parachute container failed to open properly due to a design flaw that engineers had identified months earlier. The parachute became tangled within its container, providing virtually no drag to slow the spacecraft's descent. Komarov deployed the backup parachute system, but it immediately became twisted with the partially deployed main chute and the drogue parachute, creating a tangled mess that was completely ineffective. Soviet listening posts on the ground recorded Komarov's final transmissions as he plummeted toward Earth at over 250 miles per hour. He cursed the engineers and officials who had forced him to fly in a defective spacecraft, knowing he had less than a minute to live. At 7:24 a.m., Soyuz 1 struck the ground near Orenburg with tremendous force, creating a crater and instantly igniting the spacecraft's remaining fuel. The impact was so violent that the spherical descent module was completely flattened into a disk barely a meter high. Komarov's body was burned beyond recognition, fused to the twisted metal of his spacecraft. It took recovery teams hours to separate his remains from the wreckage. His death forced a complete overhaul of the Soviet space program, delaying crewed flights for 18 months, while engineers redesigned the parachute system and addressed hundreds of other safety issues that political pressure had forced them to ignore.